It has been stated many times that GDP does not correlate with other well-being indicators, and that GDP itself is a rough indicator in order to measure the well-being of a country. Like Robert Kennedy said, yet the GDP does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their educations, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Although it is true that GDP does not correlate with all well-being indicators, there is actually a positive correlation between GDP per capita or income per capita and some well-being indicators. So as we know, GDP is the total economic output of persons, businesses, and government within a nation, and it measures the economic health of that country. While GDP per capita is the GDP divided by the population of that country. So there is actually, as I said, a positive correlation between some well-being indicators and the GDP per capita. For example, the poverty line. So as we can see here, the higher the GDP per capita within a country, the higher the poverty line. Or life expectancy. So as we can see in this graph, the higher the GDP per capita, the higher the life expectancy within a country. GDP also correlates with other well-being indicators such as the Social Progress Index, which includes factors such as medical care, shelter, environmental quality, or personal rights. So here we can see the Social Progress Index of Spain with the respective scores for each of the factors. So it is true that GDP does not indicate the inequalities that might exist within a country and between countries, but it is a great indicator in order to measure the life quality of a country.
Now I will be addressing the power of GDP growth. It is important to understand economic growth for two primary reasons. The first of which is standards of living. Economic growth gives us information about how, on average, economies improve their standards of living over time. The second reason has to do with GDP's exponential nature. Exponential growth is a process by which GDP per capita grows at a constant proportion. This explains why small changes in the growth rate imply actually big differences in the level of GDP per capita in the long run. And this, in turn, is the reason why different countries have very different levels of GDP per capita. The GDP growth rate is the change in the level of GDP between two dates relative to a base year. And the formula is defined as y subscript t plus 1 minus y subscript t, all divided by y subscript t. So that you can understand, I conducted the following example, which shows that the growth rate in the real GDP per capita at PPP between 2018 and 2019 for Spain was 1.37%. Lastly, we have the constant growth rate rule, which we use when we want to compare the level of GDP between 2 years that are not followed consecutively. So, for example, between 2015 and 2010. In this case, we would equate the GDP of 2015 to that of 2010 and multiply by 1 plus the growth rate g to the power of t, which is a difference between the 2 years. So, in this case, 5.
Now I'm going to be talking about the factors that drive economic growth. Productivity is the value of goods and services generated by a worker during each hour of work. The differences in productivity are what drive differences in income per capita and income per worker across countries, which is why it's essential that we take a look at productivity. The productivity function on the right establishes how the factors of technology, physical capital, and units of labor all come together to generate a specific level of output of production. There is a simple relation between output per worker and capital per worker, which can be seen by setting x equal to 1 over n in the equation, where y over n is the output per worker and k over n is the capital per worker. What this equation tells us is that the amount of output per worker actually depends on the amount of capital per worker directly. What this all essentially means is that a nation can increase its productivity and consequently its GDP, leading to economic growth by either increasing its stock of physical capital, increasing the efficiency of its units of labor, or improving its technology. Overall, growth is derived from a higher saving rate and technological progress. This is because more output can be produced with the same levels of both capital and labor with more advanced technology. However, it is important to note that there are decreasing returns to both capital and labor. This means that increases in either factor will eventually lead to increasingly smaller increases in output. This is why physical capital accumulation or population growth cannot by themselves sustain general growth, because at some point the economy will be either unwilling or unable to invest enough to keep increasing capital or labor.
So, what is the principle of convergence? The principle of convergence is a theory that states that poorer economies' GDP per capita tend to grow at a faster rate than richer economies' GDP per capita. And what this does over time is it kind of levels the output per person of those types of countries, richer and poorer economies, because the poorer economies have grown so fast compared to the rich. However, does it really exist? So there hasn't been there's not clear evidence that it actually exists at a global level, but there's data that suggests that some groups of countries actually do have convergence. So this is what's explained in these two graphs. In the first one, we see that there is usually convergence amongst OECD countries and amongst Asian countries, but not amongst African countries. So here we can observe that if these groups of countries meet certain requirements, then it is quite likely for convergence to appear. And then that's exactly what we analyze in what's analyzed in the second graph, which is basically the convergence amongst OECD countries. And you can see that the output per person levels, or the output per person levels in 2018 are way more similar than they were in 1950. So this basically leads us to believe that there is convergence, but we cannot talk about a globalized convergence.
Hi, so I'm going to talk about economic policies that benefit the economic growth. Basically, policies that improve the technology, the physical capital, and human capital, which are three very important factors for the economic growth of the long run, are policies that benefit. Let's start with technology. An economy with better technology uses its labor and capital more efficiently and thus achieves higher productivity. And technology is also highly related to innovation and a country's capacity to innovate. For example, online shopping exists is because the technology improved a lot, and thus online shopping can become one main way for us to do shopping. And the next one I want to talk about is human capital. So human capital's rationale behind it is to increase each worker's productivity, and to do that, you need to improve the quality of education. For example, China's mandatory 9-year educational policy is a policy that we ask everyone to at least attend 9 years of education no matter what. Lastly, I'm going to talk about physical capital. Physical capital policies are policies that support more, better, and more efficient physical infrastructure and equipment. For example, the agricultural machine in the picture. Before, people collect agricultural products manually, which is very low efficient. However, with the upgrade of the machine, the infrastructure, people largely increase their efficiency to collect the agricultural product. So these are three factors that good economic policies should promote: physical capital, technology, and human capital.
So, how can we apply the concepts that we have learned so far? A great example of macroeconomic growth factors is the economic convergence of South Korea, one of the so called four tigers of Asia. South Korea actually went from having a 64 GDP per capita in 1955 to having a 33,429 GDP in 2018. That is a 31,000 fold since 1953. So, how did they do it? Well, first of all, South Korea invested heavily in education. This led to having a very highly skilled labor force. And because of that, there was also a lot of technological innovation in areas such as the steel industry, which led to semiconductor chips being invented. And in the end, this also showed an effective policy that was focused on exports in South Korea. Now, to end our presentation, we would like to end it with a few questions based off of the World Bank article linked above. We highly recommend you to read it. The first question is, how come that these catch-up policies do not work for other similar countries with lower GDPs, or even countries with the economic powers to implement them? The second question is, in your opinion, do you think that there are other ways to shift how much output is produced besides improvements in technology? Let us know in the class's discussion post. Till then, thank you for watching our video.